Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm here representing the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz International Prize for Water, which is appropriate given we've just heard about water. Though actually what I'm going to talk about is broader in that I will look across infrastructure sectors, so across transport, energy and water, and to some extent the interdependencies between them, and look at the risks of climate change to those infrastructures, how those risks are becoming increasingly relevant from an investment perspective because of the movement towards financial disclosure of physical climate risks, and so how analysis is developing in order to provide investors with information about those physical climate risks in order to incentivize resilience, to ensure that investments in infrastructure in the future are resilient to the impacts of climate change, as well as incentivizing financial investments in adaptation, which is so greatly needed. And those of you who've been in the adaptation themes of this COP26 will know the numbers in terms of the scale of adaptation deficit. So the extent to which there needs to be much increased investment in adaptation. These numbers come from the UN Environment Programme. Currently a need of $70 billion in developing countries, expected to increase to the hundreds of billions of dollars in adaptation investment required in the coming years, given the climatic extremes that we're facing. And this is the scale of adaptation investment which is reported at the moment. Some of it is coming from official development assistance, ODA. Part of adaptation finance is being reported to the UNFCCC. This is not the whole picture, but it certainly gives the sense that the scale of investment is far less than what is recognized as being needed. The investment is going up, but not particularly quickly, and certainly not in line with the needs. And another thing which those of you who've been here and have been watching this space over recent months will see an increasing number of 50-50 commitments. So the notion that climate finance should be going 50% to adaptation alongside 50% into mitigation. And so that represents a big increase in the proportion of investments going into adaptation. In a sense, renewable energy investments are becoming a no-brainer these days because the renewable energy is cheap and there are growing energy demands. Making the case for adaptation investment, the case is there, but it's a trickier one, and without proper understanding of the scale of physical climate risks and how investment in adaptation reduces those risks and makes propositions more investable, that's essential in order to mobilize all of that finance. This is some figures from the Global Commission on Adaptation, again on adaptation finance, where it's going geographically. And then on the top picture, what's it going into? So interestingly, again, given that we've just heard about water, actually the greatest chunk of adaptation finance is going into water. And in many senses, people who, like me, who talk about adaptation, say that adaptation is a water problem. It's to do with too little water, too much water, inadequate water quality, water not existing when you need it. I would say, so then at the other end of the scale, there's 7% of that going into infrastructure. Of course, I would say that water is a category of infrastructure. So we might bundle those things together and say that by far the largest proportion of adaptation finance is going into infrastructure. And that, I think, is bound to be the case going forwards, because infrastructure is so important for adaptation. It provides essential services to society. Those the infrastructure assets are long-lived on the whole, so they're going to have to survive in a future climate which is very different to the one which we have at the moment. And they're often in vulnerable locations. They're in floodplains, they're on the coast, they're in places which they're likely to be hit by climate change. So if we are to bridge this adaptation finance gap, there needs to be much more credible project preparation in terms of the ways in which adaptation projects are brought forwards, because a lot of what the finance community is saying is that we'd like to be investing in adaptation, but we're not seeing the projects which are readily bankable because they're not prepared in the right way. And quite a lot of that comes down to demonstrating the risk reduction benefit of adaptation, because that's where the financial case for adaptation comes from, is in quantifiably reducing climate risks. And we can use that climate risk information to prioritize where those adaptation investments ought to go. So what I'm going to come on to now is an analysis which my group does in the University of Oxford, which does exactly that, to quantify and map physical climate risk to infrastructure, identify options for climate risk management. That may be physical strengthening and maintenance. We're trying to look for as many opportunities as we can for nature-based solutions. It may be more at the systemic level. So how do we think about diversification in supply chains, for example? How do we think about backups? How do we think about the ways in which networks operate? And then there's a layer of financial protection in insurance, which layers on top of those physical protection mechanisms. The business case for all of those options then comes from how effective are they at reducing and managing risks. And by creating a ranked set of bankable propositions, one can then begin to translate that into a pipeline of forward infrastructure investments, which is what really unlocks the investment flows. So the spatial risk assessment, and we know that infrastructure is a very spatial thing. We need to know exactly where it is, how it's built, what standards is it designed to, how it's maintained, if we're going to analyze the climate risks to it. So the layers in our analysis go from climate hazards, so floods, droughts, hurricanes, heat waves, wildfires, landslides, all of those categories of climate-related hazards. We don't do that ourselves. There are many people in the University of Oxford who do, and we also use other hazard products from global providers. Our specialization is in infrastructure exposure. So not only where are the physical assets located, but also how are they connected to one another? So what are the networks which those assets are embedded in? Power transmission networks, pipe networks, transport networks, supply chains, which mean that when those assets fail, the impacts propagate far across those networks, way outside the hazard footprint where the hazard was hit and away from the individual asset. So on the infrastructure is a means of creating systemic risks. And we're very interested in the potential scale of those systemic risks, because unless you value those systemic risks properly, you're not properly making the case for adaptation. And then going from that to say, well, let's look at a portfolio of adaptation options, drop them into our analysis and see how effective they might be at risk reduction in order to create those resilient investment pipelines. Just a few examples from that. This is analysis we did with the World Bank in Tanzania, looking at the transport network. First, looking at the scale of flood risk. So this is the percentage of regions in Tanzania at risk of flooding. and then the potential changes in that flood risk going forwards. Now looking, and I'm skipping through this quickly, I know time is short, at the national transport network, and you'll see that the thickness of those lines there illustrates the density of trade of freight flow down those networks. So one can pinpoint where you intersect the networks with the flood hazards, where is the greatest potential for disruption, so where should the adaptation be targeted. And now switching along the same story, but to another case in Vietnam, again with the World Bank. We're then looking at the economic losses per day of failure, Vietnam and then Brazil on the, sorry, Argentina. Gosh, I got that wrong for our Brazilian colleagues, Argentina. Where in these ones, in both of those pictures, you're looking at the economic loss per day from, on the right, landsliding, flooding, and storm failures in Vietnam. On the left, flooding failures in Argentina. So here we're saying we're attributing the amount of economic loss that would happen were those assets to fail, and then using that to make the case for better protection, better resilience of that in order to adapt them. And the types of adaptations we're looking at, as I say, are physical adaptations, also nature-based solutions like green slope stabilization. And one needs to then look at the trade-off, the cash flow problem of, on the top, we have the benefits. Those benefits are going up. Why are they going up? Because we expect this is relative to doing nothing, to not investing. We expect the climate risk to go up. So the benefits of adaptation are going to go up into the future. But of course, there are costs, not only the CapEx, but also recognizing that these types of adaptation depend upon continued OpEx. The costs are not cheap. So this we need to be kind of upfront about this, that building resilient infrastructure is not cheap infrastructure. So we need to prioritize very vigorously. And here, so we've done that discounted cash flow calculation and looked at the benefit cost ratios for every possible strengthening investment for every possible road in Vietnam. And the thickness of the black line there is what are the benefit cost ratios of investment in those assets. And we're looking at numbers greater than 1 are the investable ones. And in fact, on the right-hand side, we've ranked, and that's actually a log scale of benefit cost ratio. So the red line is 1. And you can see that from practically all of the assets in Vietnam, actually, you can't make a case for that level of resilience. But for some of them, the ones on the right-hand end, there's an incredibly strong economic case to invest in those assets and make them more resilient. So this is why prioritization, if we're going to use those billions of adaptation finance well, we have to go through this type of exercise. And the journey we're on now is upscaling that analysis. This again is with the World Bank to do it globally. So we have OpenStreetMap data for 60 million kilometers of roads on Earth. We have a version of practically every water and wastewater treatment asset. We have 1,400 ports on Earth. We have a global power plant data sets and networks for entire power plant networks. Some of it synthetic. And so we can come up with these loss probability curves, value at risk for both direct damages and economic losses for literally, this is every road asset in Southeast Asia, and then aggregating across different regional jurisdictions. And the next stop is global. On Monday, there will be, in fact, it's been announced several times this week already, so I'm not breaking any confidentialities. The Global Resilience Index Initiative was announced by Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, by Achim Steiner, administrator from UNDP, by a whole bunch of other people. which takes this global analysis and applies it to look at risk to infrastructure assets around the world. We will be gradually implementing that over the coming year. So to conclude, this type of analysis will help to incentivize adaptation of investments. Because of the movement for physical climate risk disclosure, there's a lot of work on disclosure at the moment, but frankly, a lot of what I'm seeing is not particularly accurate. It's based only on the exposure of assets to physical climate risk, and it doesn't properly look at their vulnerability, at the adaptation potential, and at those network effects. So we need to not only disclose, but also reduce uncertainties in disclosure if we're going to create the right types of incentives. And finally, those incentives will incentivize private adaptation action, but this is not just a private problem in the sense that I've talked about systemic risk to society and social needs for adaptation. And so alongside private adaptation to secure assets going into the future, we recognize that firms can discount excessively, that they're not sometimes valuing the future. And so there needs to be additional incentives and regulatory action to make sure that the full need for adaptation is embedded in investment decisions. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.